Well, thanks everybody for joining. This is a project that started many years ago, and there's still different elements that are evolving. And so we have lots of different things to share today. So I would like to go over kind of the goal of what the project was for and the timeline of what we set out to do, and talk about who did what and who is playing what kind of role and what the map looks like, but really focus on kind of what happened after this product was created through the map, through the project. So as you can see here, we formed a work group back in 2016 when Deric approached our department at School of Public Health in building an environmental justice map for Washington State, because that was a need that the communities identify, and Front and Centered, which is a coalition of community organizations, came together to really think about how useful that map could be. And so it was towards the end of the year of 2016. And so for a few months, Front and Centered gathered different staff from different agencies, different people that would be interested in the project. And at the time, I was just starting out as a PhD student at UW and was looking for a similar or a project that really served communities and worked for a project where the communities identified and drove the need and the research objectives. And so right when we built together the work group, we spent a whole meeting of, I think, 2 hours aligning our goals and expectations and thinking about what a realistic timeline is. And I can't stress how important that was, because I think that really set us up for great success for this project. Um, in 2017, we conducted listening sessions to go back to communities and really hear what their concerns were and how people were affected by pollution, which I'll go into in a second. And then throughout 2017 and into 2018, we decided to look at different data. And then by the end of 2018, we were thinking about how do you communicate this project. And then in January of 2019, we released the map. So it was a long work in progress. And it was unfunded work. So back in 2017, when we first had our meeting, we really thought about, well, do we look for and apply for grants first, or do we start the work, because the work needs to be done? And both options have pros and cons, and one being very resource constrained, but having different allies in different places really motivated to do this work. And so we went with that option. And so it took some time, but in the end, we were able to release the map. So the goal of the partnership and project that we came to an agreement was to create a community, academic, and government partnership where everyone was involved, and it wasn't just academics leading it, it wasn't just community leading it, it was everybody all together, working together and doing what each partner does best. And then creating a map that ranks relative environmental health disparities of communities in Washington State using a community-driven framework. And I'd really like to emphasize that community-driven framework, because that really shapes our next steps in this project. So for the partners that came together, again, it was University of Washington School of Public Health, Front and Centered brought us all together, and then Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, which is a regional regulatory agency, and then 2 state agencies, which was Department of Health and Department of Ecology. And so for University of Washington, since we're researchers, we really looked at the data. We're kind of the technical lead. And then Puget Sound Clean Air Agency having a lot of experience with the regional data set and knowing different populations within there, and the Department of Health having a environmental public health tracking tool that was already funded. The platform was already there, it already displayed the data and had a visualization platform. So we were able to host our map on that tool, and they agreed to that. And Department of Ecology, which houses most of our environmental data for the state of Washington, all became key partners in this project. So right after we aligned the goals and brought the partners together, we really made sure that listening sessions was the next thing we did, so that it's the data from and the stories from communities drove the project, instead of researchers identifying the data sets first and then going, well, did we do it right? Because we might have or we might not have. And so this is really important to do. And so we went around to 11 different communities asking what kind of pollutions are really impacting their families or their communities, and what were really factors that people thought would show how your community was healthy or doing well compared to other communities. So fast forward, this is what the product looks like. It's actually an interactive tool. Right now I have a static screen, but you can actually gloss your mouse over, click on different census tracts. And this whole map is on a relative scale because we're bringing in concentration data from particulate matter all the way to vulnerability, social vulnerability data on socioeconomic status and social determinants of health. And so in order to put that all together and layer it all in, we actually use a relative ranking. So if it's the more blue you are, the closer to 1, you're least impacted by all these cumulative impacts of environmental health disparities. And the more red you get, closer to 10, you're more impacted by the cumulative impacts of environmental health disparities. And so these are boundaries of census tracts that are displayed here. And so we were able to get down to that scale where a census tract can vary between, I think, the lowest range is around a couple hundred, and then the highest range is maybe 5,000, 6,000. But on average, it's around 2,000, 3,000 census tract sizes. And so with that, we are able to get to a smaller scale and to really look at what's driving these communities and what exposures people experience and what we might be able to identify to improve the health and think about the long-term health of these communities. And so a critical element was thinking about the communication piece for this map because it was built in a partnership, and also it's something where we often think about environmental health disparities or environmental justice as such a big concept. And so we really needed to refine the language and make sure that all the partners were agreed to how we use each term, even environmental disparities or environmental justice or pollution burden or exposures. We spent, I think, about 4 months really defining and honing these terms, even thinking about how we package the material. How do we go to the press and talk about it? If somebody wants to interview you, how do we talk about the partnership? And so there are so many different layers that we brought together towards the end of this project before the launch. That way, when we were releasing the map into the world and when we were talking about it, we all had alignment and it was a very unified forefront because it truly was a partnership that really brought this product together. Oops. And so I'll pass this over to Deric now, who can talk about not just the application of the map, but where that has brought us to today.
Well, thanks, Esther. Yeah, so as Esther mentioned, so front and centered, we're a coalition of community-based organizations rooted in communities of color, and a lot of our work centers around advocacy. We do capacity building, we do community listening and organizing like we did for this project. We do research and policy development, and then work to get those recommendations implemented. So even as we were working on this project to develop the map, we were already thinking about how to work to integrate it into the policy conversations that were happening. And we work primarily at the statewide level. So we were kind of moving this as a policy recommendation at the same time we were implementing it, because we didn't want to wait for the political process to play out to realize this tool that we thought was essential. So there were a couple early examples of how we were able to get this used in a decision-making framework. One was through the Department of Ecology. They run public participation grants, which are funded by a hazardous substance tax that go to kind of pollution prevention and cleanup. And 1% of those, that tax actually goes directly to community-based organizations who are engaging communities in the solutions to do kind of pollution abatement. And so they were updating their rules for how those grants are allocated, and adopted and actually a predecessor version of this map, basically, that would score communities' grant proposals based on the degree that they were facing cumulative impacts. Another example is the Department of Natural Resources was looking to expand their urban forestry grants and wanted to prioritize the communities that were most impacted as part of that. And so they also used that as criteria. And since that time, we've seen, additional use of that. Another bill, I guess, just for example, is the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which requires our utilities to move off fossil fuels, and also requires that utilities in doing that make an equitable transition and use a kind of a new version of this environmental health disparities map. So ultimately, we were kind of, at the time we were building this, working towards a ballot initiative, which was Initiative 1631, that would require this type of environmental health disparities mapping to designate areas most impacted, and use that as a tool to allocate resources that were going to be raised. It was a revenue generating mechanism to invest in just transition, and that was going to be kind of an essential tool for that process. It also kind of created this environmental justice panel to consult on that process, knowing that while like a quantitative tool like this is invaluable in helping to point direction to the most impacted communities, it also is important to have direct consultation with the folks in those communities to identify what solutions are needed, what are the most pressing problems. So creating a kind of a body to help facilitate the kind of quantitative tool with the qualitative real world real world impacts. So that while that initiative did not pass, we continued to advance the work. And one way was through, I mentioned that Clean Energy Transformation Act, and that was in the 2019 session. And then at the same time, during that legislative session, we were advancing the Healthy Environment for All Act. And that bill would have defined environmental justice for the first time in state law, created an environmental justice task force, and actually required state agencies to use this type of cumulative impact analysis to identify and then build out their policies and programming to concentrate resources in the areas that are most impacted. While the actual kind of legislation didn't pass as a policy, it did pass as a budget item. So from last summer through today, actually, the Interagency Council on Health Disparities was funded to convene environmental justice task force with representatives from multiple state agencies like transportation and agriculture and ecology, as well as community-based organizations, to help create that definition for environmental justice, to provide guidance for agencies, for state action on using environmental health disparities map, for doing more meaningful and inclusive community engagement, as well as kind of developing goals for how do we track and identify when we're making progress on environmental health disparities, and model policies that would prioritize communities most impacted by cumulative environmental harms. So that task force has met multiple times over the course of this year. Accompanying that, we did a series of community conversations that would feed into the kind of agency process, and they are kind of on the verge of submitting their report to the governor, which will provide a framework for environmental justice work in the years to come, in which we intend to kind of build upon to advance meaningful progress, both through additional resources and through changes in policy that will help the state know where to focus to reduce environmental health disparities. So that's, I think, the piece we wanted to go through in our brief conversation about kind of where this mapping project has taken us from kind of initial question starter around like how do we actually identify the communities most impacted through application and application and policy. And it's an ongoing piece of work. We're integrating it throughout our work at Front and Centered, and hopefully provides somewhat of an example of how a partnership can be used, especially for us as a community-based organization, knowing where we wanted to go and trying to work to identify the partners that could help facilitate achieving that goal.
Great, thank you both so much. That's awesome. Now we have our panel discussion, and we like to ask each of our Lunch and Learn teams kind of the same questions over and over, so maybe we can see some themes across our series. And I'd love to encourage everybody, if you have questions on this map, please put them in the chat and we'll have time for questions after this panel discussion. For our panel discussion, we like to ask, we like to start at the beginning, begin at the beginning. So you touched on this a little bit, but let's dig a little deeper in why you decided to collaborate with someone, you know, across fields or disciplines. It can be really risky and time consuming. What made you feel that this would be worthwhile? And did you have any doubts before you started? I would love to hear both sides of the coin.
I can start. I think for me, thinking about you know, coming to school, why even I started my PhD program was really to work for communities and really build my research skills to support community-driven initiatives and community-identified solutions. And so this was, you know, really perfectly timed when Deric reached out to my department and to my advisor at the time, Edmund Cito, to think about this map and to think about how it can align. And it was just actually just a really good timing on my part and on Deric's part, I think. So I was super excited to jump into this partnership, knowing that it's a brand new partnership and knowing that, you know, any relationship can have ups and downs. And I think because of that, aligning expectations and goals at the beginning were super critical because we wanted to make sure when we get to the very end, we had similar definitions of success so we can all view it equally or at least relatively similar. And so I think, you know, approaching the partnership was just with, you know, any new relationship with a little bit of caution, but also a lot of optimism because I really felt like this project was starting off in a really solid foundation and solid footing. And we had supporters from state agencies within my department, from Front and Centered, and everybody coming together. And so it was really, you know, like all the ducks were so lined up so well for that.
Yeah, from our end, it was, you know, it was really about need. You know, we know where we wanted to go. We didn't have all the tools or the capacity to achieve it. So, you know, it actually came from, I think it was an urban at UW environmental justice meeting where I had one of the leaders from California, a researcher who did a similar project down there and learned about that we had some capacities at the University of Washington that I wasn't aware of, and folks who had been involved in the California project. So it was just a inspiration for me to be able to reach out, see what could happen. And as Esther mentioned, the timing was right. I think for us, you know, it's the capacity piece. It's also a legitimacy piece. Is, you know, people will take folks from the academic realm seriously in the way they won't often take community-based organizations in terms of this body of work too. So it was useful on both of those counts. And then it was just a factor of having good people to collaborate with, which we were lucky to have folks who were kind of really entering in really good faith and a focus on the mission and objectives, you know, over kind of like any kind of individual return to their organizations. So putting that goal out in front of us and having everyone work and contribute their what they could was a critical part of it.
Yeah, definitely, I can see that. So you mentioned a couple things that enabled your collaboration to be successful. You defined what success looks like. You had optimism. You entered it with good faith to focus on the mission instead of your individual organization. Were there any like structural things that you felt like you had to do, to any barriers you had to cross in terms of how you work as, you know, an academic and as a community organization? I'm always curious about how people find out the differences in how they work and overcome them.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of felt it out as we went, you know, very, you know, democratically done, but it was also front and center kind of facilitated the work group and kind of led and setting the agenda and doing that in a way that was collaborative. But I think that was also important to have kind of the community-based organization in control of the process rather than kind of the academic partner, because it was kind of clear where the agenda was coming from, and that was being responsive to community needs. So setting up that structure of like who's kind of facilitating and deciding the agenda, and then just building in a kind of a space where we met monthly and developed kind of a list of where we wanted to go and a map, and then we're kind of working through that, and folks would take kind of work offline yeah, what would you say to that, Esther? Any other structural moments?
Yeah, I think I really appreciated that Front and Centered was there to hold me accountable and for others to be accountable to what we had promised and along the process. I think the other thing that set us up to have such a good collaboration and to be so willing and invest so much in communication was partly because this wasn't funded. So it was very fluid. It was very flexible in the way that we wanted to shape it. Not to say getting funding is a bad thing, but that it wasn't as rigid as to the specific aims we had and the deliverables that we want. It was really how we wanted to see it, and it was very flexible in that way over the two plus years that we talked to each other. And so we would have the monthly meetings, and in between, if something comes up, I would quickly text Deric, hey, can I give you a call? And we would have some informal conversations and whatnot. And so I think all of those elements really added together to really help this be a collaborative project.
That's great to hear. So was there anything really difficult? You said all relationships have ups and downs. Was there a down point where either of you felt like this just wasn't going to work? You needed to find a new partner, you needed some alone time. And if so, what enabled you to move past this point?
Deric, do you have anything?
I don't know. I don't think in like real big challenges. I mean, there were times when we would get into conversations about what a community wanted to see out of this and kind of what the data or the empirical approach was, and sometimes it wouldn't perfectly align, but we would kind of work through it to make sure we're capturing kind of the essence of it. I mean, I think the communications element that Esther pointed out was also important one, because it was kind of at the end of the day how we kind of all claim credit for the work and kind of setting agreements on that kind of thing up front. I think it could be really helpful, and how you demonstrate the collaboration externally is like an important piece to get right.
Yeah, I think in general, this was a really, of even, comparing just short-term, long-term projects, a really smooth sailing project, I feel like. And the points of either tension was around, yeah, well, how do you balance certain things? Or I think one of the indicators that we had talked about a bit was, race or people of color. Is that an indicator? How do we represent that as a single layer concept? Because it has so many intersectionalities with all the different things that we're trying to model and trying to display. And so I think, just conversations around that, there was a lot of discussion, but I feel like this was like, I never got heartburn from this project that I may have from other things. And so I think, yeah, this was kind of my, I feel good when I'm working on this. I'm really happy to work on it and happy to talk to the people about not just this project, but, just building that relationship. I think this one was a really, really good one.
Awesome. So has anything changed about how you perceive each other's fields or your own when working together? Have you learned anything new about how academia or how community organizations work just through working with each other?
Yeah, I feel like for me, I felt like, because new partnerships, because it always takes time to build that trust, I was really worried about the timeline and just what we set out to do, and hoping that I can deliver to what I had promised to do and whatnot. And I think, yeah, it really changed my view of if we do things right, if we really talk about things at the beginning and keep up that bi-directional communication and honesty, if I can't meet a deadline, saying, hey, I know we set out to do this by next month, but maybe I can do it by the end of summer or something like that, and just having that honest conversation, I really feel like helped build that trust pretty quickly. And so I feel like that really helped me feel even more optimistic about new partnerships and really ironing out, some of the details like Deric had mentioned, maybe having an MOU or communication plan up front, thinking about how I can bring that into the field and make sure that's part of the framework of how I approach any research project or any collaboration, whether it's an old one too, thinking about, are those elements still present, and making sure that I revisit them. I think that was really big for me.
Part of what was unique here too is I think actually, in terms of kind of learning about partners was like, done other academic partnerships. I think there were less limitations here. Like the work was done to make it happen. So, often challenges can be like working on a quarterly schedule and then, okay, we have support and then it's gone, and, you know, and then like, oh, the transition of students. What we had was consistency of folks kind of working across their calendar. Like the academic calendar was not a barrier, in which maybe it could have been. And that's because the folks working on it had consistency and made that happen. And, you know, things that can get in the way of like, just like how things are funded, partly maybe because we didn't have funding, but funding issues with where it flows, that I know could have gotten in the way and didn't. So we had, learning, I guess, about how, you know, the different models of how it can work, and finding the partners that are kind of on the same page around those kind of things.
Yeah, I can feel some of our guests here. I see that some folks are in charge of grant programs, maybe taking some notes about trying to make things a little more flexible for projects like this. It sounds like that was a key factor in the success. So we have one more question for the panel, and then we'll move on to some of the good questions that I see in the chat box. So what would you recommend to others wishing to collaborate this way? Deric, what would you recommend for any other community organization wishing to collaborate with UW, and then vice versa with UW for community organizations?
You know, for community-based organizations, I think it's important to know what you want. You know, if you're going to approach a partnerships, to be clear enough on your goals, and you know, maybe it's not perfectly buttoned up, but at least have enough of a goal that you can go in and communicate that to a partner in a way that you know, you'll feel good about it coming out on the other end, and you weren't kind of shifted to someone else's agenda. So that's a kind of an important piece, and kind of understanding, you know, just the limits of capacity, and how academics and researchers can engage in projects, and what are the limitations, and how that works with students and faculty and everything in between. So, and I guess that would be the lessons too from that kind of side of being able to communicate how it works and what the limitations are up front, and identify those things, and figure out who kind of is the best person to be in a relationship with around, you know, whether it's a student, and also kind of what level of student is, you know, undergrad, grad, PhD, and what role the faculty member has, whether the goal is to kind of publish, you know, or is it about achieving kind of a real world objective at the same time, and how those things are balanced. I think those are some of the critical questions, at least, to get on the table in thinking about forming a partnership.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think one of the things that would be super helpful is always having that kind of long-term goal and that vision in mind when you're working on even like a smaller phase or a start of the project or whatever element it is, really figuring out how that fits into the partnership and the greater objective together, but also thinking about how to maintain this partnership beyond just a single project, and figuring out how to sustain it by funding, but also sustain it with the dynamics, and figuring out, you know, how to continue that work together, or that relationship together, I think is really important to think about from the very, very beginning and all along the way too. So if there'd be like a funding opportunity that comes up that I feel like would really fit well for our partnership or for front and centered, I would really keep that in mind and relay that over and support those efforts. And I think the other thing was, and it's much harder now that we're kind of all homebound, is thinking about, you know, that FaceTime and doing that in person, or just getting to know your partners, I think over time is really helpful in making sure that you are successful in whatever you set out to do together. Because I think in a time of tension, or if you have anything to discuss, or any accountability measures, or any conflict, I think, yeah, having that trust there and having that in-person time there, or that FaceTime there, really helps approach those conversations and get something fruitful from it, rather than breaking down or having issues from that.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Deric, when you were mentioning understanding who to partner with, what type of student, that was a really important learning experience for you. And I'm wondering, I mean, EarthLab, our whole mission is to connect UW research to community to solve environmental problems. So do you feel like that knowledge and how academia works is a barrier to community-based organizations partnering with the university? Is that knowledge out there, or is that something that you feel like is hidden and would be better if it was made more available?
Yeah, I think the entry point is not necessarily straightforward. It takes some sleuthing, and I was actually trying to figure out for a while, even actually where the entry point was before I was at that UW Urban event, and kind of like, who should I approach here? What's the right department for me? Because it's not necessarily perfectly lined up what we're doing with kind of the way the university is set up. So the entry piece is key. And yeah, how to kind of make that accessible. I think, the key to this was it truly was like community responsive research. So even, when the entry point is clear that it's like that balance of whose question we're trying to answer, right? And how those can align is really critical to be able to do that. And in this case, we had Esther was like doing work, publishing a dissertation, and was able to achieve that through kind of responding to a community need. But that may not, maybe in other cases that a researcher has their kind of question already laid out, or how do you navigate those waters when the scenario is a little different? Is it something that needs to be figured out, probably on a case-by-case basis, really. But
thank you. So we have some good questions about the map specifically, and we can start talking about. So one question is, could you provide more information about variables that you included in the map and why you chose those variables?
Yeah, and we have a whole report and paper, outlining that in gory detail, but we really wanted to capture initially that community concerns and what pollutions people are being affected by. So we got that list, and then we also looked at literature and other related tools that does similar things, and mainly the national one, EJ Screen by US EPA, and then California has their tool, Cal EPA, or OHIHA has Cal EnviroScreen. And so looking at their approaches to figuring out what data set is already out there that we can model, because communities said, I'm really affected by, say, air pollution or water pollution. And I think what was also equally meaningful was finding out what wasn't possible, like what would be so ideal to have, and to let state agencies know, people really want to know the asthma rates for individual census tracts, and the prevalence of asthma, but knowing that there's so many barriers to accessing that data. And right now, the most easily accessible one is asthma hospitalization, and that being at a building zip code level. So knowing the limitations of the data was also equally important to know, so we can do it in a time frame that's possible, and figuring out, what's almost there but still needs a little bit more work. And so, for example, our map has a lot of national data sets, for example, Superfund sites and proximity to Superfund sites, since if you live closer to it and there is, leaching or whatnot, then your risk is going to be higher than somebody that lives further away. Statewide and smaller cleanup sites would also, people living near those would be affected, but there isn't a easy clean-cut data set that you can just download and model. It would require so much more massaging and whatnot. And so actually, Department of Health and Department of Ecology are working on massaging out kind of that data layer set and bringing that together, so it's not on community-based organizations or for university to do that work, since they house the data, they maintain the data. And so it was a kind of work in process of bringing together community voices, literature review, what's been done, and what's possible. And so it was those four elements that really had us picking the indicators, and the indicators themselves were chosen through the work group that we had, and making sure that each one was supported by evidence and literature and whatnot.
Great, thank you. And I think you might have answered this, but somebody asked the next question, are there any limitations of using the map? So not the limitations of the variables that you put in, but in terms of using the map for policy or communications, have you found any limitations?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is, we don't ever want to label a community a certain way when you're using this map, because this is a deficit-based map. And so I think this, when we created this and along the process too, there was really a sense of people wanting also a parallel kind of asset-based map to accompany it. And we haven't been able to accomplish that. But I think it, just because of the model and the approach, there's some limitations as to how you approach the data itself. And it is publicly available, so there is that. But because of the census tract level boundaries, some of them are more artificial, like just a random street down your neighborhood. And so some of those boundaries are a little bit, it doesn't make sense for a community because your community is like 2.5 census tracts. And so the boundaries don't quite overlap or align. And so there is a little bit of that where you have to kind of bring in multiple different census tracts together when you're looking at a ranking. Deric, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think I mentioned earlier just that it doesn't replace, qualitative work or more kind of micro targeted work. It's really like a statewide picture to be able to focus your attention, and then you still have to do work after that to actually understand what's happening in each place. And it does certainly point you in the direction of, what's happening here. But it should be complemented by that qualitative work and additional kind of quantitative work to understand what a community is facing.
Yeah, just another reason to make sure everyone fills out the census too. Projects like this are built on that data. It's really important to have that be accurate as well. We have another question. This one's kind of long, so bear with me. Did you ever find that the sources of environmental degradation, such as a dumping site or an urbanized zone without permeable surfaces for water drainage, were not located in the same districts as the people suffering the effects, such as citizens downstream? I'm wondering if cross-border dynamics such as that have made implementing effective changes based on the map a challenge.
Yeah, I can answer that. So one example is air pollution, right? Because if there's a fire in British Columbia, we're affected by it, but depending on which data set you use, it may or may not get picked up. And so we made sure for things that may have different effects or things that aren't like the point source and the impacts, if they're separated, we made sure that those were modeled as best as we can. And so for the air pollution data, for example, we used a regional data set that actually includes Canada, basically the whole Pacific Northwest, and the data set that all of those regulatory agencies bring together. And so it's a more homogenized approach rather than just cutting out our state boundaries and just looking at that. And so, so there are ways that we did navigate around some of those potential issues. Water was tricky, and so we actually only have wastewater discharge data in the map layer because drinking water, just the samples and what the quality of the data around drinking water quality is poor because of so many private wells that are used in the state. And so because of that uncertainty, we were actually not able to bring that in, since just because you live next to one of those public water system doesn't mean that you're drinking that. And so there was an added layer of complexity. There are other mapping tools like the California one where they are able to model that, and they've done quite a sophisticated job around it. And so we're hoping once the data catches up to the up-to-date kind of snapshot of what the water quality looks like, we will hopefully, we as in the general, since this project is not funded, the general state can model that and bring that in as a layer.
Great, thank you. That's a really interesting question. So it sounds like the origins of this really successful partnership so far: good timing, good people, clarity of roles, having a community lead, having optimism and faith that we're all in this together. Deric, you said this came about because you attended the Urban at UW meeting. Kudos to Jen and Teresa. Could you explain how you found out about that meeting, why you attended? We're always curious about that very initial entry point into connecting with UW.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know exactly what, I mean, I think it was an environmental justice event. Another colleague at Front Center may have been on kind of a planning piece to it. I can't remember if that was the right event, but kind of aware of what's happening. And I think, the impetus to show up was this opportunity to connect with someone who had built something similar in California, and knowing that there's that opportunity to make it happen. So, you know, it's in many cases, it won't be like that. I don't think, where, you know, folks have the bandwidth and capacity to kind of show up and kind of prospect for partners on something. So I'm not sure. Yeah, it's the best lesson to learn from of that, because I think it also will take outreach and you know, going out and talking to folks and understanding just what are you working on, you know, what do you need, and that's going to be a big part of it. And that, you know, there's not that much of that happening that I'm aware of, but there's some, you know, we definitely get inquiries, you know, from grad students and things like that about, you know, interested in working with you on a project. So yeah, so that case is just kind of like, it was a little bit more driven because we knew it was about who and what they were working on.
Great. Well, I don't see any more questions. Otherwise, we can give everybody a little bit of time back. But just really want to thank you both for being here today to share this project. We'll have some more information about this project on our website. As we said, we are recording this, so we'll be able to share that with you all. If your colleagues have missed it and want to check it out, you'll be able to share it. And we have some really great events coming up. Please check our news and events site at EarthLab. We'll have our monthly Lunch and Learn series. And we have some salons that talk about climate justice and tribal engagement, which we're really excited about. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Have a good day.